Hello, my name is Bryan. For the past 15 months, I've been a detective with the Arthur Conan Doyle collection at Portsmouth Central Library. During that time, I've been doing some research into the life and career of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I've had the privilege of using some of the 16,000 books contained in the archive at the library. As a result of this, I've become reacquainted with Arthur Conan Doyle's stories of the supernatural. I first read these back in the 1970s. This was long before I read the more well-known Sherlock Holmes stories. This evening, I would like to include some of my personal favourites of Arthur Conan Doyle's supernatural stories and talk about his personal interest in the occult and unexplained. For the purposes of this talk, I've divided the stories into 4 different categories: ghost stories, Egyptian mummy stories, horror stories, and other stories of the supernatural. 18th century supernatural stories, those of the so-called Gothic era, were written by such authors as Anne Radcliffe, Monk Lewis, and Horace Walpole. Their stories were set in such locations as ruined moonlit abbeys and ancient castles. These were invariably haunted by chain-rattling apparitions and other nameless horrors. These stories were replaced during the Victorian and Edwardian eras by a more modern, realistic style of writing. This was a golden age for stories of the supernatural. The Victorians in particular were deeply interested in seances, table rapping, and apparitions of the dead. Not surprisingly, this fed through into the fiction of the day. There were also many journals and magazines that published supernatural fiction. These included the Strand magazine, Blackwood's magazine, and the Cornell magazine, to name but a few. These publications offered a steady stream of income for established authors. They were also an ideal training ground for novice writers. One of Arthur Conan Doyle's earliest stories was The Haunted Grange of Goresthorpe, a true ghost story. In this, 2 young men spend the night in a haunted manor house where they witness the ghost of a murderer who is terrorised by his victim. The Haunted Grange of Goresthorpe was written when Arthur Conan Doyle was 18 years old. Sometime around 1877, he submitted the story to Blackwood's magazine in Edinburgh. However, the story was never published in Arthur Conan Doyle's lifetime. Instead, it ended up in Blackwood's archives, where it remained for many years. It was eventually unearthed and published by the Arthur Conan Doyle Society in the year 2000. The original manuscript is now in the National Library of Scotland. During the next several years, Arthur Conan Doyle regularly submitted his stories in a variety of genres to the magazines and journals of the day. Among those selected for publication was his ghost story, The Captain of the Pole Star. This was first published in Temple Bar magazine in 1883. It later appeared in book form in The Captain of the Pole Star and Other Tales in 1890. Arthur Conan Doyle had served as a ship's surgeon on a whaling ship named Hope in 1880. He later used this experience for The Captain of the Pole Star, which is set on a whaling ship in the Arctic. The Captain of the Pole Star is told from the viewpoint of the ship's doctor, John McAllister Ray. His diary records the events that occur when Captain Craigie is haunted by the ghost of his deceased fiancée. The Captain of the Pole Star is a highly atmospheric ghost story, as this passage illustrates, quote, "When we got on the ice, I lost sight of McLeod, but I pushed on in the direction where I could still hear the cries. I followed them for a mile or maybe more, and then running round a hummock, I came right onto the top of it, standing and waiting for me, seemingly. I don't know what it was. It wasn't a bear anyway. It was tall and white and straight, and if it wasn't a man nor a woman, I'll stake my Davy it was something worse." End quote. Arthur Conan Doyle wrote several more ghost stories over the course of his career. These include The Bully of Brokers Court, How It Happened, and The Story of the Brown Hand. First published in the Strand magazine in May 1899, The Story of the Brown Hand, now known as Brown Hand, is a chilling tale of an apparition that haunts an eminent surgeon named Sir Dominic Holden. The story is related by Dr. Hardacre, who was Holden's nephew. While practicing in India, Sir Dominic Holden has to amputate the left hand of a man from a mountain tribe. Waving his fee afterwards, Holden asks if he may instead keep the hand for his collection of pathological specimens. The tribesman agrees, but he warns Sir Dominic that, quote, "I shall want it back when I am dead." Holden laughs this off. The hand is destroyed in a fire at Sir Dominic Holden's house in Bombay. Holden eventually returns to England, retiring to a country estate and manor house in Wiltshire. It is there that he is visited by his nephew, Dr. Hardacre. A few years later, the tribesman dies and his ghost appears to Sir Dominic Holden in England. The apparition is searching for his amputated hand. Initially unaware of these details, Dr. Hardacre agrees to sleep in the laboratory where Holden keeps his new collection of pathological specimens. Waking from a deep sleep, Dr. Hardacre sees the apparition, quote, "He walked slowly and his eyes were cast upwards towards the line of bottles which contained those gruesome remnants of humanity. He seemed to examine each jar with attention and then to pass on to the next. When he had come to the end of the line, immediately opposite my bed, he stopped, faced me, threw up his hands with a gesture of despair, and vanished from my sight." Early in the story, Dr. Hardacre tells Sir Dominic Holden and his wife about his own interest in ghosts. Quote, "I concluded by narrating my experience when, as a member of the Psychical Research Society, I had formed one of a committee of 3 who spent the night in a haunted house. Our adventures were neither exciting nor convincing, but such as it was, the story appeared to interest my auditors in a remarkable degree," end quote. This seems to reference a real-life investigation into a haunting that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was involved with. I will cover this later in the talk. How It Happened was first published in the Strand magazine in September 1913. It is Arthur Conan Doyle's shortest ghost story and is told through a spiritualist writing medium. At just 3 pages in length, How It Happened is a model of economy with a strangely comforting twist at the end. In 1925, a British company named Reciprocity Films produced a silent movie adaptation of How It Happened, one of a series titled Twisted Tales. It was directed by Alexander Butler. Unfortunately, it is now thought to be a lost film. In The Sussex Vampire, Sherlock Holmes says to Dr. Watson that this agency stands flat-footed upon the ground, and there it must remain. The world is big enough for us. No ghosts need apply, end quote. However, Holmes's creator took an entirely different view of ghosts. In 1891, Arthur Conan Doyle joined the Society for Psychical Research. A few years later, he accepted an invitation from the Society to help to investigate a supposedly haunted house at Charmouth in Dorset. Conan Doyle's co-investigators were Dr. Scott and Frank Podmore, who was a leading light in the psychical research. Their aim was to investigate psychic phenomena that were said to have been experienced by the occupants of the house. These consisted of a Mrs. B and her family, together with a widow referred to as Mrs. D, and her 2 children, a young woman aged 20 and a boy of 15. The investigation took place over 2 nights. Dr. Scott left after the first night when nothing happened. On the second night, events took a more interesting turn, as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle later recalled in his autobiography, Memories and Adventures, 1924. Quote, "In the middle of the night, a fearsome uproar broke out. It was like someone belabouring a resounding table with a heavy cudgel. It was not an accidental creaking of wood or anything of that sort, but a deafening row," end quote. The deafening row had seemed to come from the kitchen. Conan Doyle and Frank Podmore rushed in there at once, but they found nothing out of place. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote that what occasioned it we never knew. However, Frank Podmore disagreed with Conan Doyle. After interviewing the children of Mrs. D at some length, Podmore concluded that the fearsome uproar, together with the other phenomena, had probably been caused by the boy, possibly aided by his sister. However, the story does not end there. Some years later, the house burned down. The skeleton of a child was also dug up in the garden. In Memories and Adventures, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote, quote, "The suggestion was that a child had been done to death there long ago, and that the subsequent phenomena were a sequence to this tragedy. A young life cut short in sudden and unnatural fashion may leave, as it were, a store of unused vitality, which may be put to strange uses," end quote. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's spiritualist beliefs grew considerably in the 30 years between the ghost hunt and the publication of Memories and Adventures. This could account for the shift in attitude from his initial conclusion to his later statement on the case. Arthur Conan Doyle also wrote two highly influential short stories with an Egyptian theme. The first of these, The Ring of Thoth, was first published in the Cornhill magazine in January 1890. It later appeared in the book The Captain of the Pole Star and Other Tales. The Ring of Thoth, which is set in the Louvre in Paris, concerns the discovery of an elixir of life and its terrible consequences. In 1892, Harper's Monthly magazine published Arthur Conan Doyle's story, lot number 249, set in a fictional old college in Oxford. It tells the story of a student named Edward Bellingham. Bellingham buys an Egyptian mummy at an auction. He then discovers how to reanimate and control the creature, setting it on to people against whom he has a grudge. One of Arthur Conan Doyle's early influences was the American master of the horror story, Edgar Allan Poe. This is evident in Conan Doyle's description of the mummy, quote, "The blotched skin was drawn tightly from bone to bone, and a tangled wrap of black, coarse hair fell over the ears. Two thin teeth, like those of a rat, overlay the shriveled lower lip," end quote. Another of the undergraduates is a medical student named Abercrombie Smith. He is pursued along a lonely lane by the mummy. Quote, "Even as he gazed back at it, it had lessened its distance by 20 paces and was fast closing up on him. Out of the darkness, he had a glimpse of a scraggy neck and of two eyes that will ever haunt him in his dreams," end quote. Lot number 249 was adapted for the 1967 British television series titled Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The script was by the renowned television scriptwriter John Hawksworth. Both The Ring of Thoth and Lot number 249 have inspired a number of films. A classic 1932 Universal Pictures film, The Mummy, starring Boris Karloff, is a case in point. A scroll of Thoth is even featured in the film. In 1959, Hammer Film Productions remade The Mummy in colour. It provided an early role for the actor Christopher Lee as the Mummy, who is controlled by a murderous Egyptian named Mehmet Bey. This aspect of the plot owes much to Arthur Conan Doyle's story, lot number 249. In 1895 to 1896, Arthur Conan Doyle visited Egypt with his first wife, Louisa. Many years later, he became involved in the so-called Curse of Tutankhamun. In November 1922, the Egyptologist Howard Carter discovered the tomb of the pharaoh Tutankhamun. The fabulous treasures in the tomb captured the collective imagination of the world, and newspaper reporters clamoured for a story. However, the financial backer of Howard Carter's excavation, George Herbert, the fifth Earl of Carnarvon, signed an exclusive contract with the London Times. This led to some rather suspect stories, as other journalists scrambled to produce copy for their papers. These included a so-called curse that would be visited on those who had broken into Tutankhamun's tomb. The Earl of Carnarvon died in Cairo on 5th of April 1923. He was just 56 years old. The official cause of his death was blood poisoning followed by pneumonia. This occurred after the Earl of Carnarvon had nicked a mosquito bite with his cutthroat razor. The newspapers reported that the Earl of Carnarvon's pet dog howled and then dropped dead at the family seat at Highclere Castle in England. This supposedly occurred at the same time as the Earl's death. All the lights in Cairo were also said to have gone out for 20 minutes. Meanwhile, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was being interviewed by a journalist from the Times. The reporter mentioned the Earl of Carnarvon's death to Conan Doyle, who then gave his own rather unorthodox views on the Earl's death. According to Conan Doyle, it was possibly due to curses or elementals that were invoked by ancient Egyptian priests to guard the tomb of the pharaoh Tutankhamun. Quote, "There are many tales about the powers of the old Egyptians," Conan Doyle added darkly, "and I know I wouldn't care to go fooling about their tombs and relics. There are many malevolent spirits," end quote. The views of such a famous figure as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, as reported in the Times no less, made the story a sensation all over the world. In that same year, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle once again voiced his views on the mysteries of ancient Egypt. On this occasion, it concerned the premature death of his friend, Bertram Fletcher Robinson. A respected journalist and editor, Bertram Fletcher Robinson worked for some of the leading periodicals and newspapers of the day. In 1904, Fletcher Robinson began to study the so-called unlucky mummy in the British Museum. His aim was to write some articles on it for the Daily Express. The unlucky mummy is actually a mummy board, i.e. an inner coffin lid. It has been in the British Museum since 1889. Catalogued as a painted mummy board of an unidentified woman, it has been blamed for many personal and national disasters. Bertram Fletcher Robinson wrote a front-page article for the Daily Express under the title "A Priestess of Death." Fletcher Robinson wrote that, quote, "It is certain that the Egyptians had powers which we in the 20th century may laugh at, yet can never understand," end quote. In 1907, Bertram Fletcher Robinson died of typhoid fever at the age of just 36. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had his own opinion on the premature death of his friend, quote, "Then he was overtaken by illness. The immediate cause of his death was typhoid fever, but that is the way in which the elementals guarding the mummy might act," end quote. Arthur Conan Doyle also wrote a number of horror stories during his career. One of the best is the story of the Brazilian cat, which was first published in the Strand magazine in December 1898. It later appeared in the collections Rather Fire Stories, 1908, and Tales of Terror and Mystery, 1922. The story tells of a young man named Marshall King. He is the rightful heir to the miserly Lord Southerton, his rich bachelor uncle, who keeps Marshall King in a state of poverty. One day, Marshall King receives an invitation from his well-to-do cousin, Everard King. After spending an adventurous life in Brazil, Everard has returned to England. He has also brought back a collection of animals from Brazil, including an enormous creature known as a Brazilian cat. Accepting the invitation and with a view to obtaining some money, Marshall King travels to Everard's country house, where Everard shows him the Brazilian cat. Quote, I was gazing into a large empty room with stone flags and small barred windows upon the farther wall. In the centre of this room, lying in the middle of a golden patch of sunlight, there was stretched a huge creature, as large as a tiger, but as black and sleek as ebony. End quote. Everard King is next in line to inherit Lord Southerton's money and estates, should anything happen to Marshall King. Wishing to inherit everything, Everard tricks Marshall and locks him in with the Brazilian cat. A battle for survival follows as Marshall King tries to outwit the creature. Arthur Conan Doyle chillingly describes Marshall King's predicament. Quote, it was wonderful to see so great a bulk passing like a shadow, with hardly the softest thudding of velvety pads. The candle was burning low, so low that I could hardly see the creature. And then, with a last flare and splutter, it went out altogether. I was alone with the cat in the dark. End quote. I think that paragraph perfectly illustrates Arthur Conan Doyle's ability to create atmosphere and terror in a story. The reader is hooked and then drawn in right to the very end. The new Catacomb was also published in that year in the Sunlight Yearbook under its original title of Burger's Secret. It was published as the new Catacomb in collected volumes of Arthur Conan Doyle stories from 1900 onwards. Its two protagonists, described as famous students of Roman remains, are a rich young Englishman named Kennedy and Julius Burger, a European who is older and poorer than Kennedy. Burger has found a new catacomb on the outskirts of Rome, which Kennedy is desperate to know more about. But Burger will only tell him if Kennedy reveals all about his love affair with a Miss Mary Saunderson. Kennedy's caddish behaviour has resulted in, quote, a great scandal which has damaged you and ruined her, according to Burger. It has also resulted in a broken engagement to an unnamed man. Reluctantly, Kennedy agrees to Julius Burger's terms. Burger then takes him to the new catacomb. Arthur Conan Doyle powerfully evokes the scene. Quote, everywhere along the walls, packed as in the berths upon an emigrant ship, lay the Christians of old Rome. The yellow light flickered over the shriveled features of the mummies and gleamed upon rounded skulls and long white arm bones crossed over fleshless chests. End quote. The new catacomb is a satisfying story of revenge. The only monster here is one man's thirst for retribution and the horror that this can bring. To me, it has an echo of the Edgar Allan Poe story, The Cask of Amontillado. Arthur Conan Doyle's The Leather Funnel is a full-blooded horror story. It was first published in 1902 in McClure's magazine and has since appeared in a number of anthologies. It is told in the first person by an unnamed narrator. He is asked by his friend, the occultist Lionel Darkray, to take part in an experiment. Darkray believes in psychometry, that the leather funnel of the title has the power to transmit facts about past events. The narrator agrees to sleep near the leather funnel, with disturbing results. He dreams of a woman who is tried for 3 murders and is forced to confess to them by means of water torture. Quote, at the same moment, one of the varlets approached with a dark object in his hand, which even in my dream filled me with a vague feeling of familiarity. It was a leather funnel. With horrible energy, he thrust it, but I could stand no more. My hair stood on end with horror. End quote. By leaving it there, Arthur Conan Doyle suggests the horror of the situation. He doesn't completely show it. It is left to the reader's imagination, and it is all the more effective for that. Modern horror fiction writers, please take note. In 1910, the Strand magazine published The Terror of Blue John Gap. This is again told in the first person in the form of a diary. This literary device is used in a few of Arthur Conan Doyle's supernatural stories. It is an effective way of telling a story, giving it an immediacy and directness. The story is told through the diary of a doctor named Dr. James Hardcastle. Recuperating from an illness, Hardcastle goes to stay at a remote farmhouse surrounded by the Derbyshire Hills. Being a rational man, James Hardcastle ignores the warnings of a local man who tells him of, quote, the terror that lives in the Blue John Cave. Several sheep have also mysteriously disappeared. After a few expeditions into the Blue John Gap, James Hardcastle finally encounters the creature. Arthur Conan Doyle expertly conveys a feeling of anticipation and dread in this section of the story. Quote, I was conscious of the loom of some enormous shape, some monstrous, inchoate creature, passing swiftly and very silently out from the tunnel. I was paralysed with fear and amazement. Long as I had waited, now that it had actually come, I was unprepared for the shock. I lay motionless and breathless, whilst the great dark mass whisked by me and was swallowed up in the night. End quote. At the conclusion of the story, James Hardcastle speculates that the monstrous creature could be part of the ecosystem of a vast subterranean lake or sea, which is fed by the great number of streams which pass down through the limestone. From the depths of the earth in the terror of Blue John Gap to monsters in the upper atmosphere in the next story, The Horror of the Heights. This was first published again in Strand magazine in November 1913. It was later published in Tales of Terror and Mystery 1922 and has since appeared in many anthologies of horror fiction. The story is told through the pages of the Joyce Armstrong fragment, a bloodstained notebook that is found in a field on the borders of Kent and Sussex. Mr. Joyce Armstrong is a wealthy aviator who is determined to break the altitude record. He also believes that, quote, there are jungles in the upper air and there are worse things than tigers which inhabit them, end quote. Joyce Armstrong is also bent on finding one of these air jungles. Taking off in his monoplane, he ascends the skies over Wiltshire, eventually reaching a height of 41,000 feet. However, Joyce Armstrong is not alone. He soon catches sight of a creature that he describes as follows, quote, conceive a jellyfish such as sails in our summer seas, bell-shaped and of enormous size, far larger, I should judge, than the dome of St. Paul's. It was of a light pink colour, veined with a delicate green, but the whole huge fabric so tenuous that it was but a fairy outline against the dark blue sky. End quote. There are also so-called serpents of the outer air. These creatures are, quote, long, thin, fantastic coils of vapour, like material, which turned and twisted with great speed, flying round and round at such a pace that the eyes could hardly follow them. End quote. These creatures are not harmful to Joyce Armstrong, but something much more sinister is lurking in the clouds. It is a monster that Joyce Armstrong describes as being, quote, fashioned of some transparent, jelly-like substance. It was nonetheless of much more definite outline and solid consistence than anything which I had seen before, end quote. The creature then attacks Joyce Armstrong's monoplane, quote, the vague, goggling eyes which were turned always upon me were cold and merciless in their viscid hatred. I dipped the nose of my monoplane downwards to escape it. As I did so, as quick as a flash, there shot out a long tentacle from this mass of floating blubber, and it fell as light and sinuous as a whiplash across the front of my machine, end quote. Joyce Armstrong escapes and returns to Earth. However, he is determined to go back again to the air jungle to obtain proof of what he has seen, with tragic results. The Horror of the Heights was published just a decade after the Wright brothers made the first controlled powered flight in an aircraft in 1903. The altitude record when the story was published was just over 18,000 feet. It was not until 1930 that the record exceeded that mentioned in The Horror of the Heights. The Horror of the Heights is a highly imaginative story that is one of the best examples of its time. Indeed, its powerful imagery anticipates the later cosmic horrors of the great American author H.P. Lovecraft. Arthur Conan Doyle's interest in spiritualism began in the late 1880s when he was living in Southsea in Hampshire. By the end of his life, he was a convinced spiritualist. One of Arthur Conan Doyle's stories that features spiritualism is Playing with Fire. Originally published in the Strand magazine in March 1900, Playing with Fire is the story of a séance that goes horribly wrong. When he wrote Playing with Fire, Arthur Conan Doyle had already attended many séances. He used this first-hand experience, together with his descriptive powers, to set an atmospheric scene, quote, so we sat in silence and expected, staring out into the blackness in front of us. A clock ticked in the passage. A dog barked intermittently far away. Once or twice a cab rattled past in the street, and the gleam of its lamps through the chink in the curtains was a cheerful break in that gloomy vigil, end quote. Soon the sitters at the séance realised they have conjured up a dark, uncontrollable force, quote, some huge thing hurtled against us in the darkness, rearing, stamping, smashing, springing, snorting. The table was splintered. We were scattered in every direction. It clattered and scrambled amongst us, rushing with horrible energy from one corner of the room to another. We were all screaming with fear, grovelling upon our hands and knees to get away from it, end quote. Playing with Fire has been published in a number of anthologies. It was also the 13th and final episode of the 1967 television series, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The script was again written by John Hawksworth, and it was directed by Piers Haggard. One of the most famous of the Sherlock Holmes stories, The Hound of the Baskervilles, was inspired by the folklore of Dartmoor in Devon. In March 1901, Arthur Conan Doyle was staying at Cromer in Norfolk with his friend, the aforementioned Bertram Fletcher Robinson. Arthur Conan Doyle later wrote that, quote, "One raw Sunday afternoon, Robinson began telling legends of Dartmoor, one of which concerned a spectral hound," end quote. Bertram Fletcher Robinson later wrote Conan Doyle, quote, "He listened eagerly to my stories of the ghost hounds, of the headless riders, and of the devils that lurk in the hollows," end quote. Fletcher Robinson had grown up listening to such legends. He also lived on the borders of Dartmoor. In 1907, Arthur Conan Doyle wrote in a letter that the Hound of the Baskervilles was, quote, "really based on nothing save a remark of my friend Fletcher Robinson's, that there was a legend about a dog on the moor, connected with some old family," end quote. The model for the villainous Sir Hugo Baskerville in The Hound of the Baskervilles is thought to be Squire Richard Cavar. He was Lord of the Manor of Brooke in the parish of Buckfastleigh in the 17th century. Cabell was, by all accounts, a bad lot. According to one legend, he sold his soul to the devil. Another claims that he murdered his wife after accusing her of adultery. When Squire Cabell died in 1677, it was said that a pack of howling black hounds, breathing smoke and fire, surrounded his manor house. Cabell also allegedly leads a pack of demonic dogs across Dartmoor on the anniversary of his death. After his death, a large stone was placed on Squire Cabell's head to prevent him rising from his grave. A building known locally as the Sepulchre was also erected over his grave. There are a number of legends about phantom black dogs in British folklore. Arthur Conan Doyle may also have been influenced by these. After all, Conan Doyle and Bertram Fletcher Robinson were holidaying in Norfolk, which is home to the legendary hellhound Black Shuck. This huge beast is said to have glowing red eyes and haunts the lonely rural areas of Norfolk and Suffolk. The Hound of the Baskervilles is not a truly supernatural story, as Sherlock Holmes solves the case through logic and reason. However, it was inspired by tales that were believed to be true by the people of Dartmoor for centuries. I believe that the supernatural stories of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle are among the best ever written for that genre, but they were neglected for many years for two reasons. Firstly, the Sherlock Holmes stories cast a long shadow over the life and career of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. They tend to eclipse his work in other genres. And secondly, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was incredibly prolific. He wrote many short stories, novels, plays, and non-fiction works. Sometimes it's difficult to see the wood for the trees. However, thanks to the work of modern anthologists such as Peter Haining, David Stewart Davies, and Mike Ashley, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's stories of the supernatural have been rediscovered. Two collections that I would recommend are Tales of Unease and Playing with Fire. Tales of Unease is selected and introduced by David Stewart Davis and is published by Wordsworth Editions. Playing with Fire, the weird tales of Arthur Conan Doyle, is edited by Mike Ashley and is published by the British Library. This anthology also contains a Conan Doyle's essay, Stranger Than Fiction, which recounts his own spiritual experiences. This has never been reprinted before. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's stories of the supernatural deserve to be read and enjoyed, as they make our spines tingle and our hair stand on end with horror. Before I finish, I would like to thank Laura for giving me the opportunity to do this talk. I would also like to say thank you to Pat Goodall for helping me with the PowerPoint presentation, and senior archivist Michael Gunton for finding the images. And thank you all for being here.